Good morning. It's the third time in Bhutan for me, and it's like coming home when I landed yesterday morning, because that's where my heart is. Even though in the next 12 and a half minutes, I will mainly talk intellectual. And the reason is very simple. While I founded the GNH Institute, my main profession over the last 20 years was business, and still is. So I'm one of these guys where we want to convince to change their habits, their mental models, their way of doing things. I'm one of these guys that in the next 35 years need to learn how to nourish and bring employment to probably about 10 billion people on this planet without destroying the environment to a level where we already consume or destroy 60% more than the world can recover every month, every day, every hour. So I'm a scholar, I'm an experimentalist, I'm not an academic, and what I'm talking about will be basically two thoughts which have accompanied me over the last 10 years and gradually started to take form. Because I believe bringing GNH into business, and I don't want to underestimate the challenge to bring it into governments, but I think we will face even some bigger challenges bringing it into business, which has a little bit to do with culture. I think the first challenge is that over the last decades, centuries, we have gradually unlearned that business, that work is part of life. And I'm always quite provocative by saying work-life balance is kind of a scary discussion. Because if work is no more part of our life, we look at work more in a correlation of no life, death or sleep or whatever. So I think, first of all, we need to bring back the dialogue, not simply on how to bring happiness, how to bring well-being in the workplace, but first of all, to get the understanding back in the working environment where most of us spend probably about 20% of our active life awake in our life. We need to bring back the awareness that this is about life. So we might face the same people, and when we go in analytically, we look at people. But most of these people have grown up in an environment where they don't consider work anymore as being part of life. So we need to unlearn this. And that's part of the challenge we have. And the other challenge is, and as I promised to you, I will take it very intellectually at the beginning, the other challenge is that actually there's no mandate for a CEO to make his employees happy. And yes, there are some studies that say that happy employees are more profitable, more productive. While my PhD work was about knowledge worker productivity in the context of the GNH model in business, and actually there are no such studies. There are very few, but they are not representative. The master stream of business considers success the way the system is set up. So we need to be honest to ourselves that we need to create two new dialogues when we start bringing GNH into business. And this goes in most, and here I'm more coming from my corporate background, this comes from a point that people don't see the need for happiness. And you mentioned it in the opening. I had a similar experience with Harvard students. So I think we need to look at these fundamental two questions, and that's what I want to do in the remaining 10 minutes. Coming to challenge number one, I believe we first need to heal that discussion from work-life balance into work-life integration. And I think the way Bhutan sees work as part of life balance is an outstanding example where the understanding is embedded in a national culture that work is part of our lives. So the first step actually we need to realize when we come into economics as a whole, for 250 years, economics has been built on rather transactional work activities. And those transactional work activities, and as I mentioned, there are a few studies which actually prove the contrary, those actually work extremely well with the established way of extrinsic motivation, pressure, and you name it. But there's a chance which in my view is unique and which comes in the backflow of all the discussion around digitalization and other things, that work change. That world changes after we have industrialized most of the transaction work, we actually start digitalizing cognitive work. And we need to look what's left over, and that leftover will grow and be the massive amount of work we will see, and that is intrinsic motivated cognitive work. And when you look at science, cognitive work is largely driven by employee well-being and happiness. So the first step, I think, in the dialogue we can do is saying, look guys, it was nice to build up that economy on the way we have built it up, basically on intrinsic motivation, but when we look at happiness, that is actually one of the main drivers for intrinsic motivation, and that's what we need to do. And when we look at intrinsic motivation, there are actually two compelling theories. And as I told you, I'm not an academic, but I spent quite some time to research literature, whether there's any other solution than bringing GNH into business. I couldn't find one, so I went back into the intrinsic motivation studies, and intrinsic motivation is driven a large extent by school out of the self-determination theory from Deci and Ryan, which basically say it comes from autonomy, relatedness, and competence. So we, to become intrinsically motivated, seek for these three factors in a work environment or whatever environment. And Deci and Ryan are nicely disputing with a guy called Valorant, who actually says, yeah, that's all fine, but we need to see this on three different levels. We can't see work and motivation only on an individual level. We need to see it also on a social, environmental view and the big picture. Now, while they are disputing, I think that's the next step we can look at by just looking at what if they are both right. And if they are both right, you have three conditions on three levels, and this is not major mathematics. 3 times 3 makes 9, and coincidentally, the GNH model has 9 domains. So I spent the majority of the year 2014 in figuring out if there's any correlation between these theories and a GNH model brought in a corporate context. And actually, when you do this, and I can't elaborate on all the details, and it's pretty similar to the book we have received yesterday. If you actually do this, you translate health into care, you translate life balance into lifetime balance, and you go criteria by criteria, you figure out that actually translating GNH into corporate context combines the two compelling and most important theories of intrinsic motivation that exist today in psychology into one single model. That's why I have this strong belief and this humbleness towards what Bhutan has brought in the world, because in my view it goes far beyond the governmental function. It actually offers a tool which has yet not been seen anywhere else that combines intrinsic motivational factors. Let me see if the laser works. So you have the corporate, the team, and the individual. That's a hierarchy model on the top. You have on the left side the 3 factors from the self-determination theory, and you match them, and it becomes one harmonized model. So I believe question number 1, how to bring this back into a corporate discussion, is not about a nice to have. I think bringing GNH into a corporate context is a fundamental prerequisite to create also the conditions for cognitive performance in any work environment. And here I'm talking, I worked in aerospace, I worked in electronics, textile, engineering. Most of those people who came from abroad, either with an Airbus or Boeing, has flown in my parts. So I think the fundamental baseline of a future model of business success where we need cognitive performance is GNH into business. And we need to put that self-confidence to that discussion. The second question I face every time, not only when I talk to business students, but also when I talk to CEOs. Because they come with all their measures on turnover, profitability, cash flow, and the measures they have been used to the past. And we need to understand from what mental model that comes. That comes from a mental model over 250 years of economic teaching, where we believed that financial factors give us a good indication for the future. We basically extrapolate the past into the future by just taking the same factors. These were the most relevant ones to build something which is a global economy today, which feeds us, which brings us clothing, which let us fly around the globe. So there are good things on it, but the fundamental assumption is those other factors which are important. Now, when you deepen that discussion over the last 20, 30 years, all of a sudden new buzzwords come up, like creativity, innovation, empathical work within networks, and collaboration. So basically, these guys are coming up and say, yeah, we need these things. So again, we go back and say, well, how you measure it? And they can't measure it. But there's already an openness in business that those factors, which go much beyond financial needs and financial terms, are relevant for a successful future. And if we understand, and that was the answer to question one, if we understand the fundamental prerequisites for those, we can argue that future business measurement and KPI will look like this. If we do the foundational factor and know the foundational factor for cognitive performance, they automatically will lead to financial performance. And then we have a smooth discussion. We don't need to talk anymore in slowing down business to the benefit of CSR, but we really show business what is the next level, the next upgrade of business thinking. And that will, in my view, automatically come with the strive for digitalization, with the strive for creativity, innovation, and so forth. And I tested this out. As I said, I started translating the GNH factors into business factors from a business CEO perspective. I started about 7, 8 years ago. Spent quite some time, a couple of years ago, on my PhD on it. And basically, without going into all the details, we can look at what is living standard in the concept of work relationship. And we look at a physical work contract, but we also need to look at a psychological work contract. And we can also look at health. Now, of course, the CEO will say, I have no influence on the health of my people, but there are concepts like the concept of care, and there's a sufficient baseline for the concept of care, where you can balance physical care and mental care aligned with the GNH concept, and bring the background, the philosophical background, into a work context. And you can do this with psychological well-being. There's thinkers on psychological well-being. You can do this with education into learning organizations, which Peter Zenger has driven a lot. So you can actually bring in a lot of concepts which are just puzzle pieces in one big picture. And then you can go into companies, and that is what I did with big companies of the size of a couple 100,000 people like Siemens, Bombardier, and others. And I simply evaluated their I call it GCH factor to pay my respect to the Bhutanese model, evaluating those companies and predicting actually employee happiness. So I believe GNH actually offers even a step further, that we don't need to ask people anymore how happy they are, because GNH provides a baseline to understand what are the fundamentals. And that's the approach the Bhutanese government is doing also. They're not always asking, what do you want? They basically have understood the foundations and embraced a path of continuous improvement which business needs to do. So, in a nutshell, I believe there are 2 questions we need to add on in our discussion to make the discussion boardroom-proof. And I'm saying this from a boardroom experience. We need to tell the people, well, there is a fundamental basis on intrinsic motivation which leads to those cognitive performance factors you're all searching for. And secondly, we can build you a measurement system which actually leads to the financial performance, but actually embraces the CSR prerequisites. We at the moment are more in a should discussion. It will be actually a must-be discussion. And to close, I give you just a few examples from my own experience. As I said, most of the time, more than 20 years actually, I spent in a CEO position, from startups to 2,500 people plus, and in boardrooms of a couple of 100,000 people. The effect is, I was in the electronic industry, and all these companies actually were supposed to be closed. Till today, I can say I didn't fire a single person in any of those companies, even though they were supposed to be closed. And people sometimes say, I can walk on water. That's actually not true. I just apply the GNH principles in business. But the outcome was here a duplication of turnover in an industry like in Germany, when nobody actually would invest a penny in it. I worked in an engineering, or lead in engineering consultancy firm with 35% fluctuation rate, which we turned with applying GNH values below 11%. That is, in the consultant industry, outstanding value only within 15 months. And in a 2,500 employees organization, as a CEO, we actually transformed the entire company in a way that not only we could cope with currency differences and all these things, but we actually tenfold increased the typical business we were doing.
We're out of time, Rüdiger.
One sentence? Just a promise. As you said it, I published a book in April in one of the big management publishers in Germany, Germany being one of the leading nations in business. So I just want to experiment. It actually tries to build that bridge. It starts as minus 250 years from today with Adam Smith, explains the flaws in that model, which have been serving well over 250 years but needs to be redesigned, explains all the individual factors, and my promise is that you get the translation available, at least in the electronic version, in the next 6 months. And just to pay my honor to the GNH organization in Bhutan, Dasho Kama Umba, I brought you the first print of the German version. The English will follow.